And we're officially recording. So I will turn it over to Debbie. Dun, 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 dun.
Thank you, Mary Dell. Hello, everybody. It's great to see you again. I presented to your chapter, oh gosh, way before the pandemic, a couple years ago, maybe, when we met in Columbia, and I'm really happy to be back with you again. For those of you who I don't know, I do know some of you. Some of you that don't know me, in a previous life was a fundraiser as well. I did healthcare fundraising up in North Carolina and have been at the bank for almost 7 years. And now I advise the very people that I was. I work with nonprofits, I work with individuals and family foundations. And today we're going to talk about donor advised funds. My style is going to be very relaxed, and I want you to interrupt me and ask questions along the way. I cannot see the chat because the bank got rules. So Mary Dell's going to negotiate that for us and just interrupt as we go. But I think I'm going to get to everything, and I hope we can have a super healthy discussion about donor advised funds today. All right. I'm going to share my screen. Everybody see that? Awesome possum. All right. So yes, I'm a philanthropic specialist and I only work with charitable clients. That's all I do all day long, every day. And I frankly have the best job in the bank because I'm not a banker. If you'd have told me years ago that I'd be working at a bank, I'd have told you you are crazy. Not my thing, but here I am. Let's see. Here's the things that we're going to touch on today. And I'm going to be kind of jumping around, but this is what I hope that your takeaways are after today. First of all, what is a donor advised fund? There's different types, and I want you to understand the different types that are out there because that makes a difference. I also want you to know who are the largest providers of donor advised funds, and this will come into play a little bit later. I want you to know why philanthropists like them, and we're going to talk about why I know you don't like them and help you kind of understand why they're in use so much. We'll talk about the pros and the cons from the donor's perspective about what a donor advised fund does for them. And then also, I hope to give you some tips on how to break the code on how to work with your donors that do have donor advised funds, whether they admit that to you or not. All right. So first of all, let's talk about the donor advised fund, the fastest growing charitable vehicle that's out there. And it's just kind of mind blowing. The reason why they're so hot is because it enables and empowers that donor to quickly respond to a philanthropic impact that they want to have. And primarily it's because of technology. It's all online. Once they're connected to the right donor advised fund, except for community foundations, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But when they are with a national provider, for example, they have a website that they go to and they manage it all themselves. They can do it at 10:30 at night in their pajamas, or they can do it on the fly. Sometimes there's multiple people that can have access to that. So I think that's part of the appeal in our ever-growing technology of our world. It's also a great way for the financial advisor side of the picture to deepen the relationships with clients. There are some statistics that say of high net worth clients, who are mostly your donors, 90%, 91% of them are philanthropic. But only about 40% or less of the financial advisors out there are having any kind of discussion about philanthropy with their clients. And the clients really desire that. So when the financial side of the house really digs in to understand a client's philanthropic nature, it makes a big difference to deepen that relationship between the two of them. And money is very personal. And sometimes we forget that. And then nationally, you need to know that donor advised funds in 2019 exceeded $38 million. So that's how much they grow each year. There are national charities, there are community foundations, and there are single issue charities. And you can see on my slide the size of these offerings that are out there for donors. There's zillions of them. This is the technical explanation about what a donor advised fund is. It's owned and controlled by a sponsoring organization. So, for example, Wells Fargo offers a donor advised fund for our clients. Wells Fargo, the way a donor advised fund works is when you put money into your fund, the fund is sponsored by a 501c3, thus being the charitable deduction at that time. Wells Fargo is not a 501c3. We're very much a for-profit organization. So we partner with a national charity that serves as our sponsor. So it works like in a healthcare plan, how you have a TPA that administers the healthcare plan. They're not giving you the shots and administering the meds, but they're handling all the administrative ends of it. That's kind of how these national charities will work. So when the sponsoring organization is really the controller of the money and all the processes to make those grants and report back to the client. The account over which the donor puts for their charitable dollars, they have advisory privileges. So where donor advised funds can trip people up is it says they may make grant recommendations. Well, they're like, well, that's my money. I want to know where that's going. Technically, it's not their money. Once they put their funds into a donor advised fund, that is an irrevocable gift. Now the sponsoring charity owns the money. And so that's why the term grant recommendation is used in the donor advised fund world. And the good news about that is the sponsoring agency is doing all the due diligence to make sure you, the nonprofit, is in good standing with the IRS and you're really a 501c3 and all those types of things that we would do for other charitable donations. It's low cost and super effective, and we'll get more into that. So here's kind of a picture view of what that looks like. Here's your donor. They put their money in an irrevocable gift, meaning they can't take it back into this vehicle, which is their donor advised fund. At that point, they get a tax deduction. So every time they put money in, that's when they get to take the tax deduction of their gift in that tax year. And it depends if it's cash or if it's highly appreciated securities or anything else for that matter. At that point, the fund sells the assets and invests the proceeds on behalf of the donor. So then they're liquid and they can start making grants. And because it's invested, it makes money. So a lot of the discussions I have with donors or clients that are your donors is that they are probably receiving direct mail, getting requests from you to make donations. What I really try to work on in my line of work is to focus on what's the value of that client and are you putting your money where your heart is? A lot of people do what we call checkbook philanthropy. They sit at the kitchen table and they write checks to whoever that has been asking them for money with maybe not a lot of thought to the impact that they could really have. Especially high net worth people want to feel like they're doing something important and try to really strategize how they are giving their money away. So the good news about having an invested fund is that fund grows and it can grow quickly depending on how it's invested. And they get a lot of choice into that. So here's their fund, it's growing in assets, and they are then able to make grants out of that fund. And that's when the money comes to you. And I'd be really curious a little bit while later to understand what do you see on your end. Here's some benefits. It's online. It's easy for them to use. They don't have to deal with the administration, any taxes. There's no 990 to do. There's no minutes to report. It's very easy on the administrative side for the donor. Um, the charitable deduction is taken in the same year, and they can do grants as often as they want. The company that we use with Wells Fargo is we partner with National Philanthropic Trust. They cut checks twice a week. So it's ongoing all the time. It's not like a grant cycle like you have with Duke Endowment or somebody like that. And the tax deduction they get depends on the gift that they made, right? So cash is king, but they also are mostly what I see going into a donor advised fund are highly appreciated assets. So that donor is avoiding long-term capital gains. In the tax plan that Biden has out, long-term capital gains is getting ready to skyrocket if that passes. So this is going to be something I'm really watching to see how it affects what donors do. The other thing that's really key here is they are allowed to be anonymous. And this might be somewhat frustrating to you, but for some people, it's really important that they're anonymous. So typically, if I'm your donor and I'm going to give you a bunch of money for your capital campaign, and I was like, I really want to be anonymous. You and I are talking, I've got this cash, I've got these assets and I'm giving to you. And you keep me anonymous to your public, but you know who I am. I have some situations where people really don't want anybody to know. And this is a great way for them to truly be anonymous. You get a check from National Philanthropic Trust or whoever the provider is, you don't really know who's behind it. Super frustrating. I know this, but there's reasons why that person's doing that. And there's less of that than you would think, but this is an option with donor advised funds, which makes them very popular. Okay, so there's different types of donor advised funds. You've got your national charities, you've got your community foundations, and then you've got your single issue charities. And what I find fascinating is donor advised funds, even though they are hot ticket right now, they've been around since the 30s, right? And they really started picking up steam in the 90s. Wells Fargo started our donor advice fund back in 2011, but they really didn't put a big engine behind it until about 2014. And the only reason why we got into the game is because we had clients that were asking us to do that. So the national charities that you might be familiar with, the big three are Fidelity, Schwab, and Vanguard. Those are the largest, been around the longest. Those are the big three, if you will. National Christian Foundation has a big presence in the South. And I know several people that work with them. So community foundations, our very own Central Carolina Community Foundation is the one that you might be familiar with. They are very focused on serving their community, right? So they're going to want to direct donor advised fund gifts to things like scholarships and the charities that are a part of their community foundation. National charities are very agnostic because they don't care where the money's going as long as it's legal, right? A single issue charity like Harvard, for example, Harvard will sponsor a donor advised fund, and you, as a Harvard alum, can be a part of that donor advised fund, but they're going to want a percentage of that total fund to come back to Harvard, which is the whole reason why they're doing it. This is because they're going to earn some money on that. So that's the differences between the three types. Got it? So another thing that makes donor advised funds really popular and interesting and used is that they take anything just about as an asset. So compare this list with what you have in your gift acceptance policy. Oh yes, please tell me you have a gift acceptance policy at your nonprofit. Thank you, good job. So it's very likely that you take cash and appreciated securities and mutual funds. It's probably very likely that you can be named as a remainder beneficiary in someone's will or an IRA or even a life insurance policy. Great ways to get gifts. But there's also things that are what we call specialty assets. that you may or may not take, and for good reason. Maybe you shouldn't at your nonprofit. And things like real estate. I had a guy fund his donor advised fund with an airplane in a 1031 exchange that he made. I've had people use closely held stock, which you may not take in your organization. So any kind of crazy thing that they have that they want to put to a different use than what they're getting out of it now, donor advised funds can do this. It's just really fascinating. And I've had the fortune to be a part of some of these types of gifts. Real estate. I don't know many nonprofits, maybe universities that would take real estate, and for good reason, where a donor advised fund can certainly take that. It takes a little longer to liquidate. There's a lot of extra steps involved in the process, but for donors, sometimes that's the answer. So the largest thing that we see people contemplating, should I have a donor advised fund? Should I have a private foundation? And you probably have donors in your donor pool that you know are either just individuals that are super passionate about the things that you support, or they might have family foundations. Family foundations can be small, they can be large. Sometimes it's hard to find out information about them. Sometimes family foundations use donor advised funds in conjunction with how they do their grant making, and I can talk about that in a little bit. But here's a little bit of a deep dive to compare how they compare to each other. So a private foundation is an independent entity that makes grants, whereas a donor advised fund is really just an account, if you will, as part of that sponsoring organization. Private foundations have ultimate control. So people that are control freaks, or entrepreneurs, they really like family foundations, right? They can name trustees, they can have mission statements, they can determine who the charitable recipients are, either by naming them in precatory language in their documents or having a set way that they do things. Whereas a donor advised fund does not have any of that administrative burden, and they still have to go through a process of getting their grants approved. But I don't think I've ever seen but one or two turned down. And it's just the same way as any other kind of giving to be charitable. You can't give to your nephew, John, to go to school directly. You can give it to the school, and you can give it to your charity of choice, but you can't give it to a person. With the private foundation, you can involve your family, and they can also be paid. The rule is, and it also depends on how the foundation is drafted, but they can receive reasonable compensation. That's how the IRS terms how compensation can be paid. And reasonable is a very vague term for a reason. I've seen paid family members anywhere from $500 to $40,000 in a year. And it should be requisite on what kind of work they're doing. Whereas with the donor advised fund, you can still have family involved, right? Because you're making a family decision. And we have lots of donor advised funds that we work with them as a family, just as if they were a foundation. They could even call themselves a foundation in the name of their fund. So a private foundation has to file a tax return. Therefore, the IRS is looking at it. They got rules they got to abide by. Whereas a donor advised fund doesn't have to do any of that. In fact, the fund administrator produces a report of all their contributions, easy to give to their accountant. It also produces a list of all the grants that they've made in a given year, which is very desirable to have. This point about combining charitable vehicles. I'm working with a family, and they're not in South Carolina, they're in North Carolina, and they had a family foundation. And then there was an inheritance of like another $20 million that put it into this thing. So when you do the math on a private foundation, they have to give 5% of their market value away every year. Do the math on 20 plus million, it's a lot. They were giving away about $130,000 a year. Now they need to give away over $500,000 a year. They're not there in their head, right? And We had our first meeting. They gave away $35,000. I'm like, we got a long way to go. We got to get this done by December 31st. And I have a personal rule not to be worried about it in fourth quarter. I want it to all be out the door by then. And one of the options that a private foundation can do when they don't have all their money figured out, how they're going to spend it, is they could combine it with a donor advised fund. So if they've got to distribute $500,000 and they can only come up with $125,000 worth, what do they do with the other $375,000? They can put it into a donor advised fund. And the reason why this helps them is with a private foundation, you have to give away 5% in that fiscal year. A donor advised fund does not have that rule. There is no requirement to spend any kind of money. There's no requirement to have to make so many grants in a year, which is why you don't like them, because the feeling is by some entities, and I've been to an AFP conference actually in Boston where they had the pro and cons of this. And there's people that feel like with donor advised funds, it's just a way for financial advisors to get rich because they're managing somebody's money and they're not having to spend it and give it to charity, which is the whole point. Well, that's not true. And we'll get to that in just a minute. Also, private foundations, every entity has their minimum about what it would, for me to work with a client, I'm going to expect them to put in at least $2 million into a private foundation. Plus, you got to have an attorney, you have to have an accountant, and just the expense of building one, you better have at least $2 million to make it worth it, in my opinion. With a donor advised fund, there are some that you only have to put in as little as $5,000 to get it started. So for someone who doesn't feel like they have lots of extra assets, this is a great way for them to get started in a charitable focus. And really, that's what we want from our donors, is to be really focused on the charities that they support and how they're doing it. Here's some things that you cannot do with the donor advised fund. You can't pay for dues, memberships, tuition, auctions, events that you get tickets back, technically cannot be paid for from a donor advised fund, because that is self-dealing is what that's all about. Political gifts, that's a no-no. Any lobbying activities, big no-no. And you can't make a grant to a non-operating private foundation. You cannot pay an individual, you can't pay salaries, and scholarships is a whole nother ball of wax. Let me show you the history of donor advised funds. This is super crazy. So this is 2011, and donor advised funds were almost 5% of all giving. And this is from a National Philanthropic Trust report, but you could compare this from the Giving USA studies as well. And you can just see year after year, they have increased significantly to where in 2019, they were almost 13% of all giving. So they're definitely getting a foothold in the donor landscape. And they've increased. Look at this. Grants from donor advised funds has seen a 93% increase in the last 5-6 years. Contributions into donor advised funds are about close to $40 million, $40 billion. Sorry, billion with a B. It's crazy. Now, this doesn't really address the pandemic, which we saw all sorts of interesting things happen, as you know. But the growth has really been astounding. Two characteristics of philanthropy really jumped out during the pandemic. First of all, Americans were really generous. I mean, incredibly generous. Overall, in the US, $450 billion was given to charities in 2019. How fabulous is that? Donors are really trying to figure out that they need to stay close to what their philanthropic intent is so that they can feel that impact. And I know in the fundraising world, you've been really coached over the last several years to really share your impact, talk about impact. What's your ROI? So donors know that their dollars are going to lots of places. And I will just say, in your defense, I have a lot of people that will ask me to help them research an organization that they want to fund. And they're always looking at, well, I want to know what percentage of administration is being paid for out of all their revenue. And really, that's not fair to you because you got overhead just like, the corporation down the street. So I try to talk them out of being so focused on that, but just let me tell you, it does come up. Grant making from donor advised funds has nearly doubled in the last 5 years. So this argument that people are putting money into a donor advised fund, they're getting their tax deduction, but it never gets to the charity, that is not really the case. I know with the funds that we work with, I want to say it is between 14 and 20% of money going out to charity, whereas a private foundation only has to give away 5%. Now, I did see situations during the pandemic where some larger foundations throughout the company, private foundations, were like, they're doubling what their distribution was to help the charities that they were already supporting. So maybe some of you were beneficiaries of that. But and most people that I work with were really funding food insecurity and some healthcare projects. So some of you may not have fit into the pandemic issues, but I think that's all kind of coming back. I'm hoping you're seeing some of that. So payout rates from donor advised funds are actually very, very good, and in fact exceed what private foundations give out. So I just want to clarify that. So there were some studies that were conducted about the giving during the pandemic. Again, like I said, food insecurity was huge, and other things that helped in the lines of healthcare to help the CDC and other entities get vaccines out and help those volunteers get that stuff done. Other sectors have not done as well, and we know that, but I really do believe that's going to come back around. National Philanthropic Trust saw that grant making doubled in 2020, and that's the company we work with. How do you get around it, right? That's the big nugget of a question, and I get asked this all the time. So when you are receiving a donor advised fund gift, do you know it's a donor advised fund? Maybe you don't know. Sometimes you can tell by the check. I've had people call me and say, okay, I know you work for Wells Fargo and I got this check from Wells Fargo. Who's it from? Well, if they're anonymous, I'm not going to tell you. They're anonymous for a reason. And that just stinks, and I'm sorry. Think of it like getting a money order in the mail. You would have no idea where it came from, except the money order was printed at Circle K. So, it's be happy you had the money, and it's hard because your job is to steward those people. I get that. So I would recommend that where you have really philanthropic families, whether you are aware of them having a foundation or a collective charity bucket, if you will, you need to meet with them often. You want to steward them like you would your favorite donors to make sure you are providing the avenue for them to meet their philanthropic need, right? You want to make sure that you are sharing your programs and that you understand what their funding priorities are and that you can answer that question for them. Being able to tell your stories of impact, how you're affecting your community, make sure they know that. Don't take it for granted they're reading a newsletter. Pick up the phone, have a conversation with them. Go take them a cup of coffee. Be very intentional where you know that they are focused on you or have been focused on you, that they know you're still there and that you're still a vibrant organization. This was one that one of my colleagues recommended that I hadn't thought about, was putting a line on your pledge card that lets them make a grant recommendation to you, where you know how you say maybe on a pledge card or in your materials, let us know, I've already made a planned gift to your organization, right? Well, maybe you want to say, I've already made a grant recommendation to your organization. That's the key word that donor advised funds, that's their language. So that's how you know that you're on their list, right? As the tax landscape changes, educate yourself about what that means so that you can connect that dot for your donor. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that they're looking at in the tax plan is to increase long-term capital gains to 39.6%. Okay, so right now it's 20%. So if I have securities that I want to liquidate, that is 20% of that is the gain that I'm gonna have to pay. If the tax plan goes as is, that's 40%. That's huge. That's a huge difference. The other thing that is being discussed, and I don't see this in a lot of print yet, but one of the things they're considering is the limitation on charitable deduction, 28%. So that's going to hurt. That's going to hurt. Now, to be fair, most people that are truly philanthropic in their heart, the tax benefit isn't doing it for them. That's not why they're doing it. It's because they're really passionate about what you do. So you need to educate yourself about that as it happens so that you can talk about that and put real dollar examples around what you're asking your donors to do for you and how it will affect them. Some of them aren't going to care, and that's great. But those that do, you want to be able to share with them what that's going to look like. Stewardship, stewardship, stewardship. Just like you steward your larger donors, your smaller donors, your close donors, and your libunts. You need to be sure you're stewarding these people. Having face-to-face conversations with them. We have a lot of private foundations that we work with, and I have people that seek advice from me about requesting money from some of these private foundations. And I would always encourage you to talk to that person face-to-face if you know them already. So in a donor advised fund situation, you already know these people. And we have most of the donor advised funds that are out there are actually very small. I would say under $50,000. There are some that are very, very large that have millions in them. And what you have to understand is that the donor's not trying to keep it from you. They're trying to ease their life. They're trying to make their life simpler in how they're giving their money away. So that's really what it's all about. I just threw a bunch of information at you, and I hope that you've been able to take sips of it along the way. But I want to see what questions you have or what I might be able to go back over for you that if you didn't catch it.
Debbie, can you give us an example of a nonprofit that's done a really good job engaging with one of your clients? And then maybe an example too of somebody who's really blown it?
Okay. I will tell you one thing that really blows it. And this is not only with donor advised funds, but I see this happening more now with users of donor advised funds. And I can't tell if it's a nonprofit issue or a donor advised fund issue. So please educate me. I'm seeing less people get acknowledged for their gifts. I have a donor who made a gift of $10,000. That's a major gift for most people in December, and it's May, and they've never gotten an acknowledgement for that gift. Shame on you. And it was none of you, by the way. But that's just heinous. I'm sorry. Back in the day when I was raising money, we had to write a letter of acknowledgement within 48 hours of receiving that gift. And I'm telling you, if it was a big one like that, I'd be picking up the phone and calling them, right? So, and this guy's well known in town. He ain't any slough. He gives a lot of money to a lot of people. And I'm just telling you, he's not happy right So whatever's going on in the nonprofit world that you're not acknowledging gifts, you got to straighten that out, man. You got to straighten that out because it's very upsetting to the donors. And sometimes they don't want to make a big deal about it. And I'm like, I'll call them for you. And sometimes they don't want me to do that, but I've been known to do that. So that's the thing on your side. On the other thing is the nonprofits that have been successful getting money from donor advised funds, they've already had a relationship with that donor and they continued that relationship regardless how the money comes in. So if it's someone that you know well and you've invested a lot of time in, they're going to share with you that's how they're doing their giving. And it's okay for you to ask. I have one family that I work with, the patriarch, if you will, started a donor advised fund. Actually, he had it with the community foundation. He pulled it out of the community foundation and put it with us. Lots of reasons behind that. And in this case, he is the person that makes the decisions on the grants. And he has one of his sons will succeed him when he passes. But every family member, every sibling has to put money into it every year. Because even though it's a donor advised fund, they treat it like a family foundation. And they have a meeting where they talk about where the money's going. So in your mind, a donor advised fund is just like a family foundation. And for me, I treat them just like a family foundation. If they want to get everybody together and talk about how they want to make their grant making role, I do a lot of work with next generation. So you've got people that have started donor advised funds because they've had, great success in their careers, and they want their kids to follow along behind them when they pass away and manage that giving. Okay, well, what's the philanthropic legacy? We still have to have that discussion. So it doesn't matter if it's a foundation or a donor advised fund. The point that they want their kids to also be philanthropic is a beautiful thing. And I just can't talk enough about stewarding the people that you know that are your passionate donors, whether they're just consistent or whether they're large. It shouldn't matter.
So is it inappropriate for like someone like one of us to be like, hey, Debbie, let's go get lunch and you can tell me about how to solicit more gifts from donor advised funds? Or should we be really pursuing those relationships with the individual donors? Like, how much sway do you really have over this? And how much should we see you as like a support and go through person?
So I can talk to you about individual people if you already know what their situation is and you come to me and say, hey, I know so-and-so is your client, help me figure this out. I can help you with that. I am not going to speak on your behalf unless they ask me. Now, sometimes I do have that opportunity to facilitate a discussion. But I try really hard to be agnostic where I'm not encouraging them to support one nonprofit over another. It's not fair.
Question in the chat. What is the best way to know more about who has a donor advised fund so we can begin a relationship with that context?
I think you just need to ask them straight up. How are you managing your giving? When I was a fundraiser, the way I got my details on people, besides Wealth Engine, which sometimes is great, sometimes it's not, was reading other nonprofits' annual reports. I got great joy out of seeing where else that person's money was going. And I would talk to them about it. I said, well, I see that you're giving a lot of money to such and such. Tell me about the passion that you have for animals or whatever it is. How is it you and your family are managing your charitable dollars? They will talk to you about that. Absolutely, they will. Some families are really purposeful and they say, okay, we're going to give $50,000 this year to somebody. Who are we going to give it to? And they kind of make their list and they kind of, look at who's asked them for money, who they have relationships with. If they're on boards, that's certainly going to weigh in, but not always. So like I have a family foundation that I work with, and two of the people on the board are very involved on 2 or 3 different boards. A lot of times, because the family's making the decision, their board gift doesn't come from the foundation because somebody else goes, I don't really care. Let's not fund that from the foundation. Let's use it for something that's bigger and more meaningful to all of us. So just because they have a foundation doesn't mean that's where the gifts are going to come from. Same with the donor advice fund.
So I think we're all talking a lot about generational differences. Obviously, I have a lot of questions, so I'm just jumping on in.
Come on in.
So we're talking a lot about generational differences, and you've talked a little bit about, you've got families with multi-levels of generations getting involved into giving. A lot of us who are younger fundraisers may have relationships with the younger generation. So can you talk a little bit about what you've seen successful in navigating when the fundraiser has the relationship maybe with the younger generation instead of the established and possibly more influential and decision-making generation?
That's a great question. And I've seen that go both ways. So I do a lot of work with the next generation with families, whether that's a donor advised fund or a private foundation. And what I advocate for is giving all generations a seat at the table. Sometimes you have the matriarch and patriarch, the mom and the dad, and this, we'll just call it that, don't get enough feedback from their kids to trust them to make decisions, right? Which is so not fair. And what I will often say is, why don't we do a little test? Let's say you've got your charitable dollars that you're going to distribute this year. Let's give a piece of that pie to the next generation and let them figure it out and see how they do. And every time it's gangbusters. It works out great. So if you have the relationship with the younger generation, you might ask them, how does your family make decisions about who you fund each year? Is it a family decision, or does everybody have their own? I have also seen it where they give each person, okay, here's $5,000, go for it. You get $5,000, whatever it is. So that's a question that you can ask that donor of yours. How do you make those decisions? Is it a collective, or does each individual get to make decisions? Where it's collective, just point out, flat out ask them, what are the things that your family funds? What are the interests that you have? So if it's a family foundation, and oftentimes with the donor advised fund that's being treated like a family foundation, I'm going to make them have a mission statement. And the purposes of that is to keep them in the lanes. But you said you didn't want to fund this kind of thing, yet this is what you're talking to, which is fine if you want to go outside the lanes, but let's be clear about why we're doing that, right? And some people are really, really good about staying in the lanes, and some people have no lanes, which is fine. I'm happy that they're giving. That to me is really what's more important. So I would just be straight up and ask them, how are y'all making decisions? How can I help you be better prepared for supporting my organization? Because maybe they just need some ammunition.
How much are you seeing your donors interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice type work? Is that starting to come up, or are they solid for the same causes?
Doesn't come up. It's definitely more of a discussion within nonprofits than it is in family foundations and families that have donor advised funds. Now, there are some, less than 5 that I can think of in the state of South Carolina, that actually talk about this. Truly. And I serve 5 states. It is not a topic.
So that's not what we should be leading with, is what I'm hearing.
Nope. Unless they have shown you from past discussion or interest or donation that that's a thing. They will commend you all day long, but they really don't care.
Awesome. So good to know. Okay, so this is a more personal question. So I think every fundraiser is like, well, when I grow up, I'm going to work for a community foundation. I'm going to give away money. I'm not going to solicit money anymore. So can you talk about your career transition from being a fundraiser to where you are now, and what the benefits and the drawbacks of that are? And if somebody was thinking about being you when they grow up, what does that look like?
Mercy. So I have had 5 careers in my lifetime. I have moved around. I stayed home with my kids for about 10 years, and then I had to go back to work. And I had been very involved as that favorite board member who did anything you wanted them to do, and was actually board chair of my organization when the senior development officer was leaving. And one of my fellow board members said, that should be you. And so that's kind of how I got into the nonprofit space. And I did that until I frankly got pissed off, and answered the call when a headhunter called on the right day. I mean, in all honesty, I never thought that I would not do nonprofit work. And in my situation, I needed more money, and I was already bumping the ceiling where I was, in all honesty. But as soon as I left the nonprofit that I served, they asked me within 3 weeks to be on their board again. Because I had a lot of consistency with some of their bigger donors, because I had been around for so long as the board member, the volunteer, then the board member, then the staff person, and went back to being a board member. So I've never not asked for money. So, and I'm still asking for money, just in a different way. I love what I do because I'm working with the people that you work with. They've been blessed and they want to give back, and I'm trying to help them be better at it, right? I didn't look for this job. This job found me because of some people that I knew. So I would encourage you to keep your network strong. Never turn down having a phone conversation, because you just never know where it's going to go. Some people are driven to nonprofit work because they're super passionate about that focus of what your nonprofit does. And some people can do that all day long. I, unfortunately, was a fundraiser in healthcare. And this was right when the Affordable Care Act came about, and it just rocked our world. And our hospital was struggling to stay profitable and was going under, it was a small community hospital, which they don't stand alone anymore. So there's just a lot of changes in the field that I was in. On the flip side, working for a bank ain't all that, because there's lots of regulatory requirements. I got lots of rules. I mean, I can't even see the dang chat in a Zoom meeting. Come on, man, that's stupid. But it is what it is. So I'm very resilient, and I just let a lot of things roll off my back. And the thing I focus on is taking care of the people that are my clients, who might have been a donor, right? It's the same kind of mindset. So I think you keep your networks strong, never burn a bridge, and be open to what opens for you.
And always write your thank you notes on time.
Right. Oh my gosh, I can't even tell you.
Oh my gosh, $10,000 and no thank you note.
None. I have another donor.
Tacky.
It's awful. Now, usually it's churches. They're the worst, but they never were good at fundraising anyway. Sorry if any of y'all work for a church, but it's the way it is. And I've had people say, well, before I had my donor advice fund, the pastor or the bishop or whoever always wrote me a note. Well, maybe he doesn't know it's you. We went back and looked. It definitely says who it's from, right? So, because we look at the letter that goes with the check, I can pull all that stuff up. But I've had some pretty significant gifts to educational institutions, arts and culture institutions that never sent out a thank you note. And they were major gifts, y'all. What's up with that? And they're asking me, like, why is that? And I'm like, okay, well, someone didn't do their job is what that means.
Just saying. Debbie, this is Megan Platt. Thank you for everything.
Sure.
We get checks sometimes there is not good contact info. We go then and dig it up and find their 990 or whatever. But a lot of times, if it's from a donor advised fund, the name of the family might be on there, but it just says Wells Fargo. And I'm like, where's this? You know, I'm excited to dig in, but it's not always super easy.
So one thing you can look at, if it's a Wells Fargo advisor check, it might be from someone's IRA, because, you know, they can make a qualified distribution of up to $100,000. I think they're expanding that to 125 or 130 and whatever that is. So whoever manages that IRA, and I'm sorry, but Wells Fargo Advisors is the worst as far as understanding the connection between what the donor's doing. So that might be that. So that check could be from an IRA. If it's from National Philanthropic Trust, that is our partner for our donor advised funds. If it comes from Wells Fargo, that might be coming right out of their other account. So that's the trick. If it's coming through a true charitable vehicle, it's going to have a letter.
Okay.
If they've just directed their broker or their financial advisor to send, I want to send blah, blah, a check for, you know, $20,000, it may not have a letter because they don't connect the dots. You are welcome to call me and I can try to help you figure it out. Doesn't mean that I will, but I might be able to figure it out.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Sure.
Will you share your contact information or?
Yes. Of course I will.
And we will send out the slides, the recording, and Debbie's contact information.
Yeah, I'm going to email those to Mary Dale, and on the last page, it's got my email, my phone number. I'm still working remotely. I don't think I'm going to be back in an office till after Labor Day. I have been meeting with some clients. I'm actually going up to Greenville at the end of the month. But my office phone rolls to my cell phone, because usually before the pandemic, I was on the road about 3 or 4 days a week. So I will get back to you eventually. If I don't respond right away, leave a message. Don't just hang up, or shoot me an email. That's pretty quick too. I try to at least look at everything every day. May not get an answer to you right away, but I can try to help you track down where it came from. And then I can come back and tell you, this person loves you, but they don't want you to know. And I'm going to protect them if that's what they want.
So if that's the case, can we send the thank yous to you and then you pass them on?
If I know who it is, absolutely. So like I have private foundations that have trustees, and I do not reveal who they are unless they want to be revealed, right? Same thing. Some families are okay with knowing the world, knowing who they are. Some people really don't want to get into that. So I'm happy to be their intermediary. I'm also happy to make introductions if they are open to that.
Are there any other questions? I asked a lot of questions.
Was this helpful? Did you learn a lot?
Very helpful.
Yes,
Thank you.
super.
Extremely.
Good.
I gotta hop off, but great to be with y'all. Good to see everybody, and I'll be in touch.
Thanks, Megan. All right, last call for questions.
Debbie, working with financial advisors, what do you think is like best practice with getting them to I guess it varies person by person, but.
Girl, that's a tough one. Some of them are very good and they get it. Some not so much. So if it's one of them that's on your board, or on one of your committees, I recommend spending some time with them to understand how they work with their clients. And do they know who their charitable clients are? When I unlock that code, because I'm trying to figure that out too, I will let you know. Some are super great at getting it because they are also philanthropic. There are others that could care less. And even allowing me to come in the door and talk to their client and help them figure it out is tough. So true financial advisors that serve brokerage only, they're not on a fiduciary trust side, they're on a brokerage side.
Mhm.
They have to eat what they kill, right? So their mindset's just really different about how they manage their book of business. If you have some or one that's on your board, or if you have some type of advice, like we had a planned giving team that we had an advisory council that was some professionals in the community
Mhm.
that we had lunch for them every month, and we told them about what was going on and how we utilize planned gifts and kind of talk to them so they had better understanding about it. So if you've got some financial advisors that you know or sit on your board, it is worth spending time with them to understand how they think, and they can help make that introduction of the philanthropic client that might be interested in your mission, or how to get into more of them. It's definitely tricky. The trick is you're not, they want to know. So here's the trick. They don't know how you get paid. I actually was in a lawyer's office talking to them about our hospital, and they thought that my interest in getting bequest set up was because I was getting a commission on that.
Mhm.
So it does you good to let them know your interest in this. You're really trying to build up your organization. It's not because you're just putting money in your bank, in your pocket, right? So you need to be really upfront, especially with financial advisors, because they get paid on commissions.
Mhm.
They think you do too.
Wow.
So you need to educate them to really be your true partner so they're not threatened by you trying to take away something from them.
It's good advice. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, so one of the things you said, Debbie, I think was that we would be surprised the number of donor advised funds that are at like the $50,000 level or possibly smaller. I think most of us think about donor advised funds as like giving away $50,000 a year, but if your principal is $50,000 a year, that's a way different strategy.
Right.
So can you talk about what size gifts those donor advised funds are making?
There's
And
no limit. There's no limit. So a donor advised fund is not meant to be a pass through. I'm going to put in $10,000. I'm going to spend $10,000. It's not meant to be that. It's supposed to grow. And it's supposed to be, this is my charitable bucket over here over my lifetime. That's the thought process behind putting one together. Sometimes they're set up because of an inheritance or a liquidation of some sort in their life, that they now have an opportunity to build a charitable bucket. And sometimes they start small, but they keep adding to it. I have a guy who started his right at $1 million, and he probably puts $500,000 into it every year. He spends a bunch. He probably spends $300,000 to $400,000 a year. The other cool thing about donor advised funds, I didn't say this before, is they can set it up and forget it. So what I see a lot of people do is they put their tithes to their church in there, and they can send it out every month on the 15th. Or here's a capital campaign that I've committed to. I'm paying $50,000 for the next 5 years. I'm going to put it in my donor advised fund online portal, $50,000, pay it on June 30. I don't have to think about it at all. It takes care of it for me.
Mhm.
So it offers a lot of benefits to the donor that they don't have to manage it.
Do you see any regional differences, especially within South Carolina, between how people approach this, like Charleston, Columbia, Greenville? Or is it just,
Most of my donor advised fund clients are in the Charlotte area or the Charleston area. And that's probably only because that's where I have partners with the larger presence who have really talked it up. I don't think I have many. I do have some in Columbia, but not a lot. And it's still a teaching tool for the parents to teach their kids how, it gives them an avenue to talk about philanthropy. So you want to be their friend, whether it's the second generation or the first generation. How can I help you share our initiatives with your family? Because they all have a vote, right?
I swear I could keep going. This is so fascinating.
It's very fascinating.
I'm so glad that you're not in Spain and that you could do this with
I
us
know,
today
right?
instead.
We're going to Spain next May, maybe.
Finally.
Strike three, we're out. We're going to do another trip.
Well,
My mother and I are supposed to be in Spain right now. So, maybe next
alas.
time.
Well, if nobody else is going to jump in with any questions, I think we are going to wrap up and I will cease recording.
And I'm going to email you this deck right now.